Hey everybody, welcome to another My Thoughts On video where I cover a bunch of different games at once. In this particular case, we're going to be looking at 5 different games that I really don't have very much to say about. The reasons for which will become very clear in short order, but to give you an idea of how this video is going to go, we're going to start with Pac-Man Championship Edition DX Plus and then go from there. So let's go ahead and get started. So Pac-Man Championship Edition DX Plus is technically an update of Pac-Man Championship Edition DX, which is something that built on the gameplay mechanics of Pac-Man Championship Edition. So, Championship Edition DX was released in 2010 for Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network, and it later saw release on a variety of other systems, from iOS and Android to PC, of course. The DX Plus update came out in 2013, and it basically included a few extra features like leaderboard functionality, challenges, that sort of thing. So really I'll be talking about the core of just plain old DX here, which is Pac-Man, basically. You go around a maze, you collect the various pellets, you eventually get power pellets, which will allow you to eat the various ghosts, and you basically try to stay alive and get as high a score as possible, at least in some of the modes. Now before I get any further than what I've already said, let me first mention that the presentation isn't really all that much to write home about. It's very polished, don't get me wrong, but it's still 2D art that's really not all that impressive. They do, of course, have a few pretty nice visual touches in there to make things stand out. It's very bright and colorful, and it's definitely very easy on the eyes, except for when there's a lot of bright things going on screen at once. But let's face it, it's Pac-Man. There's only so much you can do with that. Similarly, there's only so much you can do for the sound design of a Pac-Man game. I mean, it has some basic beeps and bloops, and that's pretty much all it needs, really. We really don't expect much more from the Pac-Man series. It's one of the very few series that can get away with a sort of minimalist design. They do try to spice things up a bit with the music and some of the effects, but at the same time, the music is fairly bland electronic music that's definitely solid enough, it's just not particularly interesting. And the effects that they do add into the game don't really help it out all that much either. But where things get a lot more interesting is in the gameplay side of things. Now, I'm sure you've played Pac-Man. If you haven't played Pac-Man, there's probably something wrong with you. It's one of the games that is just so incredibly important to the history of video games that you just need to have played it. So, if you have not played Pac-Man before, play Pac-Man. I'm not talking about Championship Edition here, because this is a different monster entirely. But as far as old school Pac-Man goes, definitely play that at least once in your life. And if you get a chance to play on a proper arcade machine of the original Pac-Man, then definitely take that chance, because it's just a certain feel that's hard to replicate with any other system. I know that's something that's almost completely subjective, but let's face it, it's an arcade game. It was designed to be an arcade machine, and there is just something special about playing it on one. Anyway, with that mini ramble out of the way, let's go ahead and actually focus our efforts on Pac-Man Championship Edition DX Plus. So, as far as this goes, you take the core gameplay of Pac-Man. Going around a maze, collecting all the pellets, eating the ghosts if you get one of the power pellets, and if you can't get one of the power pellets, then if you run into a ghost, then you end up dying and losing a life. And ultimately going for the highest score possible, and you spread that over several game modes and several stages that will change things up for you quite a bit. This is because, unlike in the original Pac-Man, where you just had set mazes that you would go through and you try to collect as many pellets as possible, and you basically only have 4 ghosts chasing after you, now you can get basically a conga line of ghosts coming after you that you have to deal with at some point. In addition to the conga line, you also have roamers who will go all over the map in a sort of random direction, and you have to avoid them as much as you possibly can. This means that the optimal paths that you're going to be seeing, and you can very easily see those throughout the course of this video, may get screwed up by one of those roamers. Meaning you're going to have to adjust your movements on the fly. The thing is that when you adjust your movements, typically you're going at a pretty high speed, so it actually gets really challenging really quickly. They do give you some outs, of course. If you find a power pellet, then you can, of course, devour the entire conga line. A lot of the ghosts will actually have power pellets in them, so when you devour them, then you actually consume another power pellet, and your time is extended for that. And if you find yourself unable to adjust your route or use one of the pellets, then you can use one of the very limited resources that the game gives you in order to send all of the enemies back to the center of the map. Thing is, whenever you hammer the panic button, it ends up lowering the dot multiplier and the game speed, and you don't really want either of those things. Well, you may want a lower game speed, but definitely not a lower dot multiplier, because that means your score doesn't go up as fast. And while the modes themselves really aren't all that varied, I mean, you got your basic score and time attacks where you're trying to get the short shortest time possible in the latter and the highest score within the given amount of time in the former. And then finally there's the Ghost Combo mode, where you basically try to stay powered up and devour as many of the ghosts as you possibly can. It doesn't really matter quite as much that there is a lack of variety. They all put a different spin on the core gameplay of Pac-Man, and it brings everything to a much faster pace than what everybody's used to. It's a surprisingly fresh take on a series that at the time this was released was actually about 30 years old. Maybe somebody thought of doing something like this before Championship Edition came out, but honestly, I don't think they did it with anywhere near the level of polish that this has. It's fast-paced, it's frenetic, and it's just good old classic arcade-style gameplay that never really gets old. There's only two really big problems with Championship Edition DX+. Those are, one, the variety is fairly limited unless you are really into getting as good a score as you possibly can, and two, if you don't like Pac-Man, then you're not going to like Championship Edition, most likely. I tend to fall more in line with the latter category, because while I do somewhat enjoy Pac-Man, it's really not my favorite or anything like that. I appreciate the original for what it did for gaming as a whole, and I do like the gameplay in itself, but I can't find myself playing it for more than a few minutes at a time. So Championship Edition is one of those instances where your mileage is definitely going to vary depending on how much you actually like the core gameplay of Pac-Man. And I'd say if it looks like it'd be something that's up your alley, then definitely go for it. It's a very well-made game. It's very fast, it's frenetic, it's smooth as butter for controls. And frankly, it's surprising that the relatively few changes that Championship Edition makes to the formula were able to make it feel so fresh and different. Now what's not so fresh and different, at least as far as gameplay goes, is Thomas Was Alone. This is a puzzle platformer by Mike Bithell that was released for PC and Mac in 2012 and later on got released on a bunch of different systems. It features a very simple minimalist art style that has all of the characters being shapes and all of the environments basically just being black and white. Despite this, there actually are some pretty nice shadow effects going on with this, where when the light is going a certain direction, you'll see it casting shadows, and that actually looks pretty nice. And there are also some pretty nice particle effects thrown into the mix to spice things up a bit as well, but what really steals the show as far as the presentation goes is the narration by Danny Wallace. He does an excellent job of giving the characters various personalities through just simply describing what they're thinking. And it's all done with a bit of dry wit and humor, which makes things a lot more charming. The thing is that beyond the narration, there's not really much to the presentation. I've already gone over the visuals, and aside from the narration, there's a soundtrack which is completely forgettable, and sound effects which basically consist of a bunch of bleeps and bloops, which means that it really does fall to the story and the gameplay to bring things up, and what killed it here was the gameplay. I'm really not sure that words are sufficient to express how incredibly sick I am of puzzle platformers. Because there's only so much you can do with a puzzle platformer, and when you go for a pretty minimalist one like this one, there's even less you can do. Basically, the idea is that you use the various characters that are given to you throughout the course of the game in order to solve the puzzles. You do this by using certain characters to, say, float on water, or jump to really tall heights, or get into spaces that other characters can't in order to flip a switch. But here's the thing. That is all you do throughout the course of the game. You solve puzzles with these various characters while Danny narrates the whole thing. And so it really does fall to Danny's narration to bring things up, and it does bring things up, just not enough to overcome the unbelievably boring gameplay. I'm sure a lot of you out there will just be, oh, DW, you're just being a contrarian, you just hate everything, blah blah blah. Actually, the fact of the matter is that I know I can't stand puzzle platformers as a whole. They just bore the living hell out of me. It doesn't matter what the narrative is, it doesn't matter how good the narration is, it doesn't matter how good the presentation is, it doesn't matter how tight and refined the mechanics are. I simply cannot stand puzzle platformers. They bore the living hell out of me. And I would much rather be spending my time playing games that I actually have a chance of enjoying rather than games I pretty much don't have a chance of enjoying. It's hard enough to get me to like just a normal platformer at this point because I've played so many of them that I just got sick of them. But unfortunately, I never liked puzzle platformers to begin with, much like I don't like puzzle games in general. And quite frankly, the only reason I tried this one out was because it was a pretty high profile release. If something wins a bunch of awards and it's in a genre I don't really give a crap about, then I might give it a try anyway just to see what all the fuss is about. But just don't expect me to like it, and that is exactly what happened with Thomas Was Alone. Narration? Great. Visuals? Surprisingly good despite the minimalist style. but frankly, it is the gameplay that's going to make or break this thing for you. If you don't like puzzle platformers, do not bother with Thomas Was Alone. If you do like them, then I'd say go for it, because Thomas Was Alone was a very, very well-made puzzle platformer. They just aren't my thing. Speaking of things that are not remotely my thing, N++, yet another platformer. This one's by MetaNet Software, and it's actually been circulating around the net for quite a while. Well, N has anyway. It was kind of a popular Flash game that ended up getting a full-on remake, being N++ and everything like that. And this one was released in 2015 for PS4 first, and then later saw release on PC, after which it finally came to Mac, and it's supposed to be coming to Linux as well. And it is an absolutely bare-bones platformer. The entire idea is that you run, you jump off of walls, you slide down walls in order to collect the gold pieces to increase the time that you've been given to complete a level, and you try to avoid any obstacles. If you hit any of them, basically you die instantly. You do, of course, get infinite retries, but here's the thing. This is based on a Flash game, as in the kind of game that you would play for a few minutes because you were really, really bored and didn't have anything better to do. It is a minimalist, momentum-based platformer. If that is not your thing, then you will not like this game. It's really not appealing from a visual standpoint, although the graphics are certainly clean and easy to work with. It does run very well for the most part. I did run into a weird bug where whenever it tried to submit my scores, it always just froze the game, and thus I ended up having to Alt F4 out of it. There's really not that much to the sound design. You've got some pretty basic sounds for movement and the various obstacles that you run into, like the landmines that will blast you to bits. Then of course there's the soundtrack, which your mileage will definitely vary on that, because quite honestly I found it to be a rather annoying soundtrack. It's just really, really repetitive electronic music. Although given how ridiculously repetitive the game is, that's really not that surprising. Like I said, platformers really aren't my thing. There's a handful of them that I do enjoy quite a bit, but something like this, where it's just a basic momentum-based platformer, really doesn't do anything for me at all. Of course, your mileage may vary. I mean, the game does have quite a lot of content. I think it has something like 2,400 or so custom levels, which is pretty crazy for an indie game. Especially considering they are not procedurally generated. They're all handcrafted, and it's been crafted over the past several years, so that's actually a pretty impressive feat. It's just, like I said, if you don't like momentum-based platformers, then you're just not going to get much out of this. Next up is Mobius Final Fantasy, which was made by Square Enix and originally released for mobile devices in 2015 and 2016, depending on which region you're in. And the PC version was released on Steam actually a few days ago on the 6th. And I need to make something pretty clear to you guys going into this. I have never liked the Final Fantasy games. Post Final Fantasy VI, I have found the writing to be pretty much insufferable and the gameplay to be even more insufferable. But that's for another time and several videos, because I will be taking a look at least some of the Final Fantasy games, at least the ones I can get my hands on anyway. Just so happens that Mobius Final Fantasy in particular I have pretty much nothing to say about. For a mobile game, it is rather pretty to look at. It has rather nice visuals. It's actually done in Unity Engine 5, and they've done a pretty decent job of porting it to PC as well. Aside from the often rather terrible texture work, because let's face it, it's a mobile game, it actually runs rather well, and it looks pretty good, all things considered. But that's all it has going for it. The sound design is average at best. You have sound effects that sound like they're from just about any other JRPG ever. You have English voice acting, which is often hilariously bad, and most of the time is just pretty cringe-inducing. You have music that sounds in keeping with the Final Fantasy series, but it's certainly no Nobuo Uematsu tracks, let's put it that way. And like the rest of the Final Fantasy series, they have some very, very talented artists doing their thing for the character designs and all that. But then you get to the story and the gameplay. The story is that you are apparently the prophesied warrior of light who will do something or other. Basically just you're a big damn hero, and you're doing big damn hero things by spending the entire game whacking things in the face. Because you see, you have to prove that you are the warrior of light that will save Palamecia or whatever. And your character has amnesia. Because of course he does. This is a Final Fantasy game post 6, where everything has to be an anime cliché. Needless to say, the writing in this game is pretty f***ing terrible. Japanese game developers, please, if nothing else, listen to this statement. Stop making games where the player has absolutely no fucking idea what they're doing. Okay, so there's this prophesied warrior of light that's gonna save Palamacia. What's Palamacia? Who is the warrior of light? Who is my character? Why did I get here? What in the hell am I fighting? They're just these nebulous things. Why are people dressed the way they are? Who are these people that are around me? Why is my only interaction with the world around me whacking things in the face? Why is the protagonist an asshole? You know what? Honestly, at this point, I don't even care. And the simple reason for that is that this game can play itself. I made the mistake of accidentally selecting the skip tutorial option, which meant that I jumped into the game and had basically no idea what was going on. The thing is that it didn't matter that I didn't know what was going on, because there's this button on there that says auto, and you can click on that, and the game will play itself, and you will never lose. Ever. Oh sure, there's all kinds of weird elemental spells going on. You got big flashy particle effects as you eviscerate your enemies. There's a bunch of job system crap that you can mess around with. There's decks of abilities that you can mess with. But I don't give a crap. If the optimal solution to literally every single engagement in the game is just to let the game decide it for you, then there's no reason to play it. I don't know if this changes later on in the game, but quite frankly, I do not care. I have never liked JRPG-style turn-based combat where you just select a bunch of options from a menu and then watch as things happen. Give me some tactical options beyond, oh hey, this enemy is weak to fire, you should probably use fire-based attacks. Woo! Maybe some movement mechanics, or some special combo mechanics, or something along those lines. Instead, I get a bunch of really flashy combat where the only thing I'm doing is sitting back and watching as words pop up on the screen. I don't know what break means in this game, but it happens. So, yeah, that's a thing. Don't bother with Mobius Final Fantasy. Just don't. Especially considering that after you finish downloading it on Steam, you have to sit there and wait while it downloads even more stuff in-game. Because apparently Steam updates aren't enough for this thing. No, you need to get in-game downloads while you're at it. Just no. Don't bother with it. And last but certainly not least, we come to Risk of Rain. This is a roguelike, oh no, not another one, platformer, developed by Hopoo Games, I think is how you pronounce that, and it was released originally for PC in 2013, later saw a Mac and Linux release, and finally PS4 and PS Vita releases as well. And it's yet another indie pixel art action platformer where you run around and you fight enemies and you have procedural generation of damn near everything. The pixel art is pretty well done, although it is very, very low res, so you're dealing with some really, really tiny pixel art, and it ends up working okay in the long run, but it does make it a bit difficult to see if you play this thing at high resolutions. And all things considered, it has a pretty strange aesthetic that works pretty well for the game overall. It's just a shame that it also runs into the pitfall of, well, it's yet another pixel art indie platformer with roguelike elements. And while the visuals suffer pretty heavily from retro pixel art fatigue, the actual sound design works out pretty well for the game in the long run. It's got some pretty decent sound effects that admittedly are nothing amazing, but they work well enough for the game, and it has a rather solid soundtrack that really does propel things forward a fair bit. The problem with that is that when you keep replaying levels over and over and over again, that music quickly becomes rather repetitive. And beyond that, there's really not much in the presentation to keep you coming back, so obviously it's going to fall to the gameplay to bring things up, because as far as I can tell, there is no story in this whatsoever. And the gameplay does have some interesting aspects to it. Namely, there is a mechanic by which your difficulty increases over time. So, the more time you spend going around the levels, exploring and gathering items and killing monsters and everything like that, the harder the game is going to get. And keep in mind, the game's not exactly easy to begin with. Even on the very easy difficulty that you start out on, the game can still kick your ass pretty readily. So you really have to make a choice. Do you risk the difficulty increasing, or do you just go ahead and play it safe and move on into the next level before things get too crazy? Thing is that the further you get into the game, the harder it gets anyway, so you're gonna run into problems if you don't level up your character accordingly. surprisingly, because it seems like enemies are all just complete damage sponges. They can absorb a pretty ludicrous amount of damage before finally going down, at least compared to what you can actually dish out at any given point. You can sort of even the odds by finding various items scattered throughout the levels that can either give you passive bonuses, things like you can actually launch rockets on occasion, or you'll launch mortar strikes or whatever it may well be, or you'll find items that you can actually use. They take up a single slot that you have for items, and then you can use them whenever you feel like. And the basic idea is that you go to the teleporter, you activate it, then you sit there and you wait for about 90 seconds before the teleporter is ready to use. It freezes the enemy count so you can no longer have enemies spawning in. You defeat the rest of the enemies and then you hop on the teleporter and go to the next level. Now those items and your gradual level ups are supposed to give you a sort of fighting chance. Reality is that I've never made it past the 3rd level. You see, this game isn't really dependent on player skill. Like nearly all roguelikes and games with roguelike elements, it is almost exclusively reliant on how lucky you get. Did you manage to find just the right combination of items to get you to the next level safely? Nope, then too bad, I guess you're gonna have to restart the game again. Because that's what happens when your character dies. It has permadeath, so that character can never come back. And the only way to save progress is to play on the normal difficulty or higher. You see, progress is saved across all of your playthroughs, so certain items will be unlocked as you keep playing it, which means that you have incentive for getting lucky, which means that this is an incredibly frustrating game. The entire game is basically nothing but grinding. You grind to level up so you can actually deal with the opponents that you're facing. You grind to get enough money to be able to buy the items scattered throughout the levels. You grind to unlock things that you can use in additional playthroughs. And ultimately what you find is that the game loses steam pretty quickly. And a lot of that has to do with the procedural generation. Sometimes it will place the teleporter right next to you, sometimes it'll place it clean across the map. It is just a crapshoot as to where it's going to place it. And it's also a crapshoot as to whether or not you're going to get the items you need to actually succeed at a level, so basically you just have to get lucky. And if there's no real way to mitigate that, because there really isn't a way to mitigate that in Risk of Rain, then it just means the game is bullshit. I don't know where people got it into their heads that RNG makes everything better, because it really doesn't. And Risk of Rain is no exception there. You do get a variety of abilities that you can use, but there's only one character that I've been able to play. I don't even know how to unlock the other characters. I'm assuming you had to beat the game with that one character to unlock other characters. But none of the starting characters' abilities are particularly interesting. I mean, you got a basic attack, you've got a basic power shot that goes through enemies, you've got a basic rapid fire, and then you've got a basic dodge. And other than that, you're just jumping around and climbing on ropes. And that's it. Fighting a crap ton of damage sponge enemies for what? Just so you can get more loot to be able to get to the next level, only to have your RNG smile upon you some more, or outright say ha 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 no and just smack you in the face? Yeah, I'll pass, thanks. If for some reason you seem to think RNG is the best thing in the universe, then whatever, you're gonna like Risk of Rain, but you've got me utterly baffled. And I think that's a good note to end this video on. So if you're interested in any of the games that I've shown, I will have links in the video description box where you can pick all of those up. So check the video description box for those. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed the content for this particular video, and I'll catch you all in later videos.